This podcast was sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be tuned in today. Welcome back to another edition of the Vicars Crossing podcast. The Vicars Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And it is always brought to you by our good friends at A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. And we're back in the Vicars Crossing Zoom room, and I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
Hey, Robbie. Kevin George here. I'm hanging out at St. Aidan's Church. Glad to be back. I feel like we were just here yesterday.
I feel that you are right.
Okay.
We have to stop meeting like this.
Who's the other dude?
I'm Ian. That's it.
That's it.
That's all he's going to divulge.
I have a funny story about Ian.
Okay.
So
I'll tell you. Go ahead. I know exactly what he's going to say.
Okay. So I thought I should check in with Ian about the podcast just to clarify a question and so on. So I texted him and said, I want to ask you something. And he goes, okay. So I said, well, can we Zoom? And he says, give me a sec. So he comes up, and this was at like 12:15. Okay. So he pops up on Zoom looking like a deer in the headlights is the only way I can describe it. He was clearly asleep. And I said, so I'm about to ask you a question here about a religious philosopher. And you're like, oh, yeah, I'm good. I said, well, maybe this is not a good time to ask you. He says, no, my brain is always on.
Oh, I'm always working here.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. Let me defend myself a little bit because my computer needs to stay on while I'm uploading because I upload from an external hard drive. And if my computer's off, then the hard drive's off. So I was up until fairly late waiting for the podcast to upload yesterday.
Doing work for you, our listeners. So thank you for doing
Absolutely.
that, Ian.
That's right.
Yes.
I'll always blame it on the external hard drive.
That's right. It's not in here. It's out there.
Hey, man, it's the external hard drive. So basically, then, Ian, if I need to answer a question answered 12:15, a good time, generally?
Absolutely. Oh, I'm usually up before then, but today was a different story.
Oh, it was funny. When he popped up, it was like there was no doubt in my mind what was going on. He was just awake, like only barely alive. It was incredible.
Well, I don't want our good listeners to freak out, but this podcast will not be the three of us just yakking.
Oh, really?
In a mess. No, we actually have a guest coming into the Zoom room in just a little bit, and we're going to be welcoming author, speaker, scholar, philosopher, James K.A. Smith to the Vicars Crossing, and we're going to be talking to him in just a few minutes as well. So
very excited for that. James is written a ton of books and really big in the circles of liturgy and worship. So this is I've had a lot of messages from folks saying they can't wait to hear this episode. So
good. Well, we're just waiting for him to join us, but in the meantime, we'll chat with each other and get caught up. What's been going on the last 24 hours? I feel like the thing is, I was out at the parish this morning taking care of some stuff. And we were also there was a couple of us in there, socially distanced, but saying everything changes so quickly. Like what was normal and comfortable yesterday can turn on a dime, and the next day can feel a little bit different very quickly. So although we've only talked to each other, we talked to each other yesterday. What else has happened over the last 24 hours?
I mean, since we talked yesterday, we were talking about what happened the day before with Trump in front of one of our Episcopal churches in the United States. And since we were on the air, the bishop there, Marianne Buddy, and the priests from the parish, and now we're learning several other priests from the Washington, D.C. area were actually in the crowd of peaceful demonstrators and were tear gassed out of there along with everybody else.
Right.
And it's been good to hear the leadership of the Episcopal Church, right up to the presiding bishop, come out and denounce the sort of photo opportunity of all of it. And then, of course, yesterday, Trump brought Melania, and they went to a Catholic shrine, and the Archbishop, the Roman Catholic Archbishop, spoke out as well, saying this is outrageous. James Martin, who many people follow through podcasts and so on, has written a great piece also denouncing that. I think my favorite part of the whole thing is, though, you can see Trump whispering to Melania to smile.
Yeah, they kind of honed in on that.
Yeah, and then she goes, it's this little spot. It was painful to watch. It's like, oh, she's obviously she's either being held hostage or she has Stockholm Syndrome. That's my theory.
That's it. But one of the things that I've really gotten a lot out of over the last 24 hours is, like you say, Kevin, the leadership of the Episcopal Church in the United States doing these interviews on CNN and NBC and all that, and really putting a face on the hope and desire of the Christian community and the Episcopal community to be the agents of hope, be the agents of change, to talk about what we stand for as opposed to what we don't. They've really taken a hold of that narrative and tried very hard to lift that up. And I really would encourage people to, I would say don't get too stuck and wound up in what Trump did and make that the narrative. Listen to what these other folks are saying and start understanding that, and you start using that narrative as well. So, like, go on YouTube and find these videos of the bishops and Michael Curry, who did a great interview with CNN. These are the people that really stand out and point us in the right direction and help us to be, and they're the signposts, right, pointing to what we should be looking at, and they've been really powerful in that. So I just think that's so important.
Yeah, I agree, man. Like, that's, I mean, it has been heartening to see our leadership speak the way they're speaking.
Yeah.
What about Ian? He's been sleeping.
Yeah, getting woke up in the middle of the night. What have you been doing?
I've been binge watching Avatar: The Last Airbender again for the third time. It's a really, 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 really good show. It's one of those shows that I would argue is flawless.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I haven't checked that one out. Is that on? Where's that at?
It's on Netflix. It was like a Nickelodeon animated TV show, but it's super. It sounds, Avatar: The Last Airbender is not like a Max and Ruby kind of show. It's a pretty. I really enjoy it. It's just super clever and well written, and it's on Netflix and it's good. Yeah. 3 seasons. It's great.
I always ask our guests, one of the questions in the lightning round is, what have you binge watched lately?
Yeah, that's a good one, actually.
Yeah, a lot of people have been doing that, obviously. My wife and I always try to find one show that we can watch together. And it's not necessarily every night, but when we have time to sit down for an hour and watch something. We've been watching Ozark on Netflix. This is Jason Bateman's thing. And
yeah, I've seen that, but I haven't watched it yet. Good?
Yeah, getting some good reviews. It's kind of, it's good. It's kind of creepy. What was that movie back in the 70s with Burt Reynolds, and they were out in the Ozarks or Mississippi?
That's Deliverance.
Deliverance, yeah. It's kind of like
ding, 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 ding.
Deliverance in 2020, yeah. So there's some characters in there that are kind of scary. No, but it's well done.
Boy, you got a pretty mouth.
Yeah. I know. So anyway, we've been watching that and trying to enjoy that a little bit. But
cool.
We've got a little extra time on our hands sometimes, so
yeah,
that's all good. It's all good. What else has been going on?
Well, we've got a question today. If you're
oh, you want to do that? Yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
We can forget that.
If you're interested in finding out what's in Ian's brain.
Okay, Ian, you ready? I'm gonna get my voice into a good space here so I can introduce this segment. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for Ask Anything.
Ooh, man.
Ooh, that hurt. I need some water.
Today's question comes to us from all the way from South America. It's a listener called Luis. Luis wants to know,
Luis.
All I got was Luis.
Fair enough.
So, Luis, what? And this is appropriate today. What is your favorite sleeping position?
I,
So,
Yeah, but like, I mean, do you lie on your back? Do you lie on your side? Are you a belly sleeper? Like, how do you do it? How do you sleep?
I don't know. I'm asleep.
Oh, come on. Well, how do you get before you get to sleep?
how do you start? What's the starting position?
Lying down,
Like on your back?
just in general.
Oh, so you don't have a preferred sleeping position?
No, not really. It just kind of get comfortable, and then I roll over and get more comfortable, and then I'm out.
I think
Oh,
that
wow.
comes with age, Kevin. Is
Definitely. When your body shape changes, you'll find that there are ways you can't sleep anymore.
you cannot just flop in anymore. You know?
No, if I flop on my belly, I have to sleep like a teeter-totter, because so no, I like that. What about you, Robbie? What do you have a
Probably I would start on the side, on like the right side.
yeah.
Yeah, get the pillow properly situated, get a good neck position. It's
Yeah.
important. You want a good neck because you don't want to wake up with a crimped neck.
No, that's
You
important.
want to get that. You want to get a little knee bend.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Get some comfort around there.
Perfect for spooning.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
Yeah.
For spinning.
Yeah.
And kind of get into that nice relaxing position.
Good.
And just let the angels take you for the night.
Am I ever glad we've got a philosopher coming on here soon, because this is the sort of quality programming that people have become accustomed to here at the Vicars Crossing. It's what is your favorite sleeping position?
We need a psychologist for it.
Well, maybe true. So I too like to sleep on my side, and my preferred is left side. I like to just lie on the left side and get all my clergy meat sort of situated where it needs to be. My belly and my arms and my flabbiness, I just need to get all tucked in, and then off I go into Never Never Land, as the great poets Metallica said.
Hey, Ian, there's work to this, man. You don't just flop.
No, well, judging by what I saw this morning, he just dies. I think he's dead. But anyway, we thank Luis in South America for that beautiful question, and we encourage all of you listeners to send your questions to vicarscrossing@gmail.com, or tweet them to us, or send me a direct message, and we'll make sure when we've got our brilliant young Ian on the air, we will ask him anything. Like, what is his favorite sleeping position? Anything. Gang.
The other way to get a hold of us too, folks, if you haven't checked it out yet, is our new website, The Vicars Crossing, thevicarscrossing.com. And you can email us through that, and also get a update of some upcoming guests that we have. And we've got a really good lineup over the next month or so as we head into the summer. So we want you to look ahead and make plans to spend some time to listen to those.
I'm just taking a look here to make sure our guest has the appropriate stuff he needs to get in, because he should show up any minute here now. So hopefully. I think, and I don't know, but I think that James K.A. Smith is writing another book.
Okay.
Ooh.
And so I suspect that right now he's frantically typing, and he's going to do that until 2 p.m. sharp, which is right about now. And then his fingers are going to stop, and he's going, oh, I've got the guys on the Vicars Crossing. I got to do that right now. And then we'll have him for a bit, and then he's going to dive right back into the writing. I feel that's the way it's going to be.
Well, that's good. I mean, we really appreciate them doing this and giving their time for this, because a lot of these folks, they're obviously still working. It's not like they're just sitting there.
No, that's right.
Carve out some time. And we all know when we're writing, if we're in mid-thought and we got a bit of a momentum going, to stop or to be interrupted like that, that's a pet peeve of mine. And it's just because I don't get a lot of good thoughts. So when I'm in something, I'll go, okay, this is good. And then I got to get pulled out of it.
Okay, here he is. We have him in the waiting room, so we're ready to bring him in.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
All right, let's bring him in, and then we'll say hello, and we'll get to an introduction here. There we go. Looks like a guy is coming in here. There we are. Had good day. Hello, James Smith. Welcome.
Well, it's good to see you guys. Thanks.
Yeah. My name is I'm Kevin. I'm the guy you've been communicating with.
Yes, good to see you. Good to put a face to the name.
Yes.
Hi, Jamie. I'm Rob. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Hi, Rob. Nice to meet you.
My name is Ian. Hello.
Hey, Ian. Great to meet you.
Ian is here to bring down the number, our average age number.
Yes, indeed.
So we're glad you've agreed to join us today.
Happy to.
We're all excited to have you here. I'm just going to offer an introduction. We've begun our podcast. We brought you into the midst of it as you've come in.
Okay, great.
So we did we do a little bit of silliness before we get to some serious stuff. So we just said, and maybe we should ask you this question. I just said that it's good to have a philosopher coming on here, given the depth of the conversation we were having just before you came in. But we have a little segment called Ask Ian Anything. And people send us all kinds of questions, and they're literally about everything, anything, and everything. And today's question was a very, very deeply philosophical question,
Definitely.
which is, what is your preferred sleep position? So, James Smith, I ask you, what is your preferred sleep position?
I'm a side guy. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Left side, right side?
Left.
Okay.
Yes. Interestingly, there is a philosophical discussion of sleep
Really?
that I've referred to in a book called Imagining the Kingdom. There's this French philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and he talks about catching sleep, like the way you have to, in a sense, there's a kind of physical making yourself available to be caught by sleep, which I find just a fascinating analog to all kinds of spiritual realities.
Well, it really is.
That was a bit of the conversation because Ian, being a young guy, can just kind of flop in and fall asleep. Us guys, a little more girth, perhaps, need to set some time aside to set up, a certain position and make sure we're good to go. So there you have it.
Well,
Absolutely.
They call it sleep hygiene now. And that what that philosopher is talking about, they call sleep hygiene. So I, as someone who struggles with sleep, I've been asked a number of times as a people, with chronic care nurse and so on, they say, are you using proper sleep hygiene? Are you preparing yourself to catch that sleep? Right. So
sure. Yeah. It's crazy. Lauren Winner, I don't know. She's an Episcopal priest and writer down here in the States, teaches at Duke. Years ago, she wrote a remarkable essay in Books and Culture on sleep. And it was sort of like, so you want to change the world? Here's the first thing you should do. Learn how to sleep. It's kind of a Sabbath sort of piety principle, but
I love it.
Yeah. Hey, I love it that we're talking about sleep as significant.
It is. It's a time to catch some sleep, probably. Anyway, I should introduce you. So we've gotten ahead of ourselves. But anyway, James K.A. Smith, as he is known on the front of all of his books, is a professor of philosophy at Kelvin College, which I believe is in Grand Rapids.
That's right.
And where he holds the Gary and Henrietta, is that pronounced Biker?
Yes.
Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. Trained as a philosopher with a focus on contemporary French thought, Smith has expanded on that scholarly platform to become an engaged public intellectual and cultural critic. An award-winning author and widely traveled speaker, he's emerged as a thought leader with a unique gift in translation, building bridges between the academy, the society, and the church. You'll find his books all over the place because he's written so many of them. These influential books have been at least an important part of my journey in terms of being a liturgist in the church. These writings are formative, quite frankly. But you'll also find them in magazines and newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Slate, First Things, Christianity Today, Books and Culture, and the Hedgehog Review. And he serves as editor-in-chief of Image Journal. What's not in here is, and I'll finish with what's written here, is that he and his wife, Deanna, are elementary school sweethearts. I didn't know there was such a thing as an elementary school sweetheart. They have 4 children, but it does say here, native of Stratford. Embro, maybe?
Yeah, so we grew up, I grew up in, Deanna grew up just outside of Embro, Ontario. We went to Zora Highland Park Public School for elementary school, and then, which is just south of Stratford.
Yeah.
I was born in Stratford, and then when we got married, we lived in Stratford to begin before moving to the States. We moved to the States in '95, so
Highland Games, baby. The Highland Games.
Highland Games grew up when I was a 3-year-old boy. I used to go under the bleachers after it was done. My mom would take me over there, and you'd be looking for all the coins that fell out of people's pockets.
I'm glad that's what you said. I'm glad that's what you said, because when you were talking about being elementary school sweethearts and you started talking about going under the bleachers, I'm like, James, this is a PG podcast. Okay?
That's right. Yeah. Interesting. It's funny. You'll appreciate that when we got married, we actually had a piper, James Muir, pipe us out of the church. But
nice.
Deanna is not necessarily a fan of the pipes. So
okay.
At our rehearsal, James asked Deanna, where would you like me to stand? And she said, well, do you know that 7-Eleven on the other side of town? Of course, we would have still heard him.
Yeah.
Wow.
So she sort of sees it as drowning a bag of cats.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So that's true. So I have been to Embro now that you say that, because I've been to the games there some years ago when I used to work in Chatham. They had the Chatham Highland Games, and to Embro as well, and do their thing.
Yes.
So, yeah, so that's great.
Yes. And I think Fergus also has a Highland Games.
Fergus, big. Yeah.
Big around here. Good. Well, Jamie, we're so happy that you could take a little time just to chat with us today. We want to get into a few topics with you, including talking about some of the stuff in your books. And we want to, though, just take a minute and talk about some of the immediate news first. It's obviously on everybody's mind because we've been watching it here in Canada, obviously. It's going on. So stems, of course, in the last couple of weeks with the killing of George Floyd and the protests in the United States. There are some here in Canada going on as well, even as far away as New Zealand. We know you've been outspoken on Twitter of late, some of that. One of your tweets the other day read, "This has always been Trump's dream, like every other petulant dictator wannabe." And here in Canada, we're watching what's happening with this administration. I think a lot of us are kind of wondering every day, is there a bottom? Seems to be getting a little less, but last couple of days have brought a new low. We saw Monday with the peaceful protesters, including clergy, being gassed and pushed aside so that Trump could have that photo op in front of St. John's Church. So a lot of violence there. And anyway, I don't want to rehash the whole thing, but I just want to get your reaction. You're in the States right now. You're in Michigan. How are you feeling as a Canadian American, and what the situation is today?
Yeah, what's heartbreaking is we have occasion to revisit this so regularly. This is, I mean, it does seem like this time there has been a new multiracial ownership of this problem. My wife and I went to the protest here in Grand Rapids, the peaceful protest on Saturday night, and it was a stunning array of people. 30 people from our congregation were there. So there's I do think there's something new, but of course what's sad is how old it is and how ongoing it is. We watched, just as kind of another act of trying to be intentional, we watched this remarkable documentary called I Am Not Your Negro, about James Baldwin, great writer from the 60s and 70s. And it could have been produced yesterday. Do you know, like it could have been, it's the same, it's the ongoingness. And I do think, part of the heartbreak is that I do think this current administration literally feeds off of racial animosity.
Yeah.
And so we have no top level goal even of quelling this or responding to this. On the other hand, I do think the sectors of the church are starting to wake up to this. I'll say, as part of my own experience, growing up in Canada, I think we liked to comfort ourselves that we somehow weren't racist because we hadn't had slavery. Yeah. But you guys know. I mean, when I think back to what we took for granted in Embro, it was utterly racist, and we just didn't have occasion to manifest the systemic racism in the same way. So my learning curve on these matters in moving to the States has been long and steep. I've lived here for 25 years now. Still have so much to learn in recognizing my own complicity in this. And I'm grateful that I do think there is new energy for an intentionality about this, but it's going to look a lot more like white people shutting up and listening and learning, and giving voice to and lifting up others. And even then, we're not very good at that. Like we feel this penchant to speak, which is itself a reflection of our privilege. So it's such a heartbreaking scenario. And to know how churches respond to it. I'm on our worship committee for our congregation. My wife leads it. And, I was crafting this morning our opening words. We're not Anglican, so we kind of have to make this up a little bit more. And
I saw this actually.
But I have come to embrace that. I mean, I actually am a huge fan of the Book of Common Prayer. Mm-hmm. However, I have also come to appreciate some of the distinctives of our Reformed and Presbyterian worship, which still gives us a liturgical frame, but then there's a certain kind of flexibility where I think we answer to moments in a way. But it's hard. Like, it's very, like I'm in a conversation with our pastor right now saying, okay, well, what should our prayer of confession look like this week? Of course, on the one hand, you think, it should be this just unmitigated confession of our complicity in systemic structures of injustice. Except that's assuming that everybody confessing this is white, which is not true. So it's funny how the depth of unintentional racism can come in the best of intentions, which I think is something Dr. King was teaching us for so long. So yeah, sorry, that's a lot. There's so much more to be said, and I'm talking too long.
Yesterday we had Sarah Miles on the Vicars Crossing. She said something that was just really grabs me. She said, that this moment is apocalyptic in that there's a veil that's being torn away here. And you just mentioned all those things that were under the veil, right? Yeah. That we just did not see for those of us, and I grew up too in Windsor, Ontario, and London and Sarnia. This kind of stuff was not there in the mindset, and that was the narrative around the dinner table. I mean, the veil's been lifted, and the learning curve is sharp and steep right now.
Yeah. And I think, I grew up out east in Newfoundland, and our idea of anybody who was black, we got from Sanford and Son, Good Times. Yeah. I mean, I've told this story before, this painful admission that when I was a kid, I had to go to the Janeway Children's Hospital to have my 2 front teeth taken out. I hadn't mastered physics. I was using the leaf from the table, the one that I was using that as a teeter-totter, but I didn't understand you need somebody on the other side to balance it. So don't insert a Newfoundland joke here. But anyway, I had to go get these things taken out. And the anesthesiologist, the anesthetist, was black. And I was like 5 years old, and I was terrified. I had never seen anybody. And so you're right. And I mean, this is something we've all been steeped in. And unless we can come to grips with that and acknowledge it and listen, as you said, I mean, the time for talking is done. The time for listening is here. And, as Sarah Miles put it yesterday, and when Rob asked her, what do you feel about it? She said, it's about time,
absolutely.
Something feels different about this. Hopefully there's
absolutely.
All right. Just to shift into a little bit of your writing, if we can, Jamie, we're all, particularly those of us in sort of Eucharistic traditions, we're all hungering for communion right now because of what we're into. And as a Eucharistic community, I can say that, I hear it from our people here all the time. We miss being around a table. We miss table gatherings and all that. In your book, You Are What You Love, incredible book, just brilliant. The Spiritual Power of Habit. You write, never underestimate the formative power of the family supper table. This vanishing liturgy is a powerful site of formation. Most of the time, it will be hard to keep the cathedral in view, especially when dinner is the primary occasion for sibling bickering. Yet even then, members of your little tribe are learning to love their neighbor, and your children are learning something about the faithful promises of a covenant-keeping Lord in the simple routine of that daily promise of dinner together. I have to tell you, I revisited those words over these last few weeks because they reminded me just of the Eucharistio, the notion of what it looks like to be around our own tables. Like much of your writing about liturgy, Jamie, that is I mean, it is spot on. It's beautiful. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the importance of like the liturgies that we have at home and the liturgies we have in our lives, where we can be like the dinner table, where we can be fed, and perhaps in light of where we're at right now, as our communities are apart, at least here in Canada, they still are.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge is, we brought into the pandemic whatever we had before. Do you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like all of a sudden, it wasn't like the Matrix where when you need to fly a helicopter, you just step in and they upload it and all of a sudden you have what you need to fly the helicopter. It's so in some ways, I think some of us have realized the limitations of the habits we had cultivated when congregational worship dropped away. We found we didn't really have the built-in rhythms of a household. And I think it's better to just sort of name that and say, okay, well, now here's an occasion to adopt them. And I think it's interesting. I don't know. I sometimes worry that I overestimate the significance of this, but I've always loved that our household is attuned to the liturgical calendar as its own kind of practice. Mm-hmm. And in this COVID-19 time, I've been thinking that, how time for these last 3 months or so has just sort of been like this gray blob of indistinction. Like you have no like I've literally spent 2 hours on a day and then only later realized, oh, it's not that day, it's a different day. And there's something about locating this in the liturgical calendar that has given us sort of an identity apart from the workaday rhythms of consumption, production, so on and so forth. And it was actually the liturgical calendar that was our own gateway into the liturgical life. Mm-hmm. As we were in like the Pentecostal church, but our kids went to a Presbyterian nursery school, and they introduced us to Advent. And we made an Advent wreath together as a family, and then they gave us this sort of little litanies to use, and the kids used to love lighting the candles each night and things. And there's something tactile and physical about it. I think kids as ritual animals kind of eat up the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. And so I think that's one example of kind of papering the wallpaper of your time with that is another household reflection. It'd be interesting to hear what others have experienced in this regard.
Yeah. So for us, I mean, in my own life, I know that, my wife works in ministry as well. She works as a Roman Catholic chaplain, actually. She's a padre in the military in the Naval Reserve in Canada. And she's the director of campus ministry up at Brescia here at Western. And so, but we've had such frenetic lives that honestly, the last couple of months, we've recaptured mealtime together that we haven't had in a while, really, honestly, and preparing meals together and spending time with one another. And so there has been something sort of in a great Thanksgiving in a way about that for me, right? Like it's been life-giving. And I think for her as well. But I also think the other thing is I just think trying to find a rhythm in this sort of, it's like, in Newfoundland, we'd say it's like nailing the jellyfish to the wall. It's hard to do, but it's there's so much unknown that there's an uneasiness, I guess. And for me, one of the places I get grounded, at least before all this, was around that Eucharistic table and the community, the people. I think it's the people. And I just miss that. I miss all that.
Yeah, sure. And you'll come back to it with a new and deeper appreciation for it, I'm sure, right?
I think that's true.
Yeah.
What about you, Robbie?
Oh, I was thinking, Jamie, when you use the word tactile and the Advent wreath and touching and all that, I had a flashback of teaching a kind of a life in the Eucharist kind of thing with some young kids. And one of the things we did was I brought out bread and wine and water and candles and stoles and surpluses and all that and put stuff on. And as they were touching everything and feeling everything and holding things up and walking around the table and lighting candles and all that, they were, and it was one of the first things I'd done as a priest, they were just brought into this entire new world that up to then, quite frankly, it's because of where I was, but they had been told they can't be part of that. That's something that for the special people. So to ground them around that tactile touching and stuff. And I've always had that image in my mind around the table and watching people come up to it, that it is that physical touching of bread and wine and water and being close to each other and not socially distanced.
Yes.
Literally touching each other, kneeling at an altar rail, that is profound and incredibly deep and moving and transformative. So.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. I think I talk about it in the book, but right in this season in which we're in right now too, for my wife and I, the ritual of attending our vegetable garden up at a big urban community garden plot is this kind of creational rhythm. So there's this syncing up between Easter life and the work that the garden calls out of us. And for us as a couple, we're empty nesters now. It's another way to just sync up, as you put it, and to collaborate in common on something. And very grateful for it. Yeah. I don't know what all your experience has been too. We have found that sustaining friendships has required new intentionality throughout this time. And so it's funny how weird, Zoom cocktail hours with friends were at the beginning. And then eventually they just became kind of weekly appointments. And so that now finally our stay in place order has been just lifted. And now when we gather in person, it won't feel necessarily like this huge gap that there's catch up on, because we have been. So,
That's weird. Mm-hmm. Ian, tell Jamie how I woke you up this morning.
So Kevin woke me up this morning with a quote from your book, the "You Are What You Love: The Spiritual Power of Habit." Like straight up.
I like to make sure I keep them happy over there.
I rolled over, looked at my phone. I was like, I should probably answer this. And anyway, he said the quote is, "We have created youth ministry that confuses extroversion with faithfulness." Wow, that was a mess. It continues saying, "We have effectively communicated to young people that sincerely following Jesus is synonymous with being, quote, fired up for Jesus, with being excited for Jesus, as if discipleship were synonymous with fostering an exuberant, perky, cheerful, hooray for Jesus disposition, like what we might find in the Glee Club or a pep rally," which is amazing. That's really, really well done. And sort of personally, I find it kind of hard to be like, hooray for Jesus, because that's not really what I sort of perceive religion to be. It doesn't really make sense in my head that because Jesus tells these stories, and these stories are meant to have sort of a point to them, right? Yeah. Rather than Jesus is this fantastic guy. Like, no, there is something that happened. And I don't know. It's just I want to know what your sort of continuing thoughts are about the ideas behind, spirituality and how, I don't know, Jesus is just kind of some dude.
Yeah. And he's, I think what's so maddens me about, I'm talking about particular forms of youth ministry, which are quite dominant, I think, across traditions, surprisingly. Do you know what I mean? So even mainline traditions think, well, at least the youth guy's got to be this cool, hip cheerleader in chief.
Needs a big belt buckle that says Jesus and some tattoos.
So, and in some ways, I think it's very infantilizing of not just young people, but children. I mean, children are much more, well, as you said earlier, I do think children are ritual animals. And so I still think the best mode of inviting them into life with Jesus is to invite them into the rhythms of rituals. Like the way that Rob was describing there, like said, this is for you too. But I also think kids are incredibly curious. And they actually, I mean, the nightmare questions are the questions 8-year-olds ask.
Right.
Do you mean you all know not to ask the actual really, really hard questions because you don't want to answer them either. Whereas the 8-year-old or the 12-year-old is asking the question that we kind of have learned to like push to the side. So I think honoring the complexity of children's faith. I also think it's really, really crucial to make room for young people to to be honest about their doubts. So that,
Oh, yeah.
because if we don't do that, then it just looks like the church is scared of something or has something to hide. But of course, God is not scared of our doubts.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of young people are just suspicious because they're not allowed to question. And we could do a lot better job with that. I don't know what it sounds like you're maybe wired a bit like I am, Ian, but I also just don't think everybody is an extrovert, you know? And what really bothers me is when we just set up the template of what a Jesus follower looks like and it just maps onto being an extrovert.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of young people who conclude, oh, if that's what a Christian looks like, I guess I can't be a Christian. I mean, and that's a travesty, a literal travesty.
You were talking about kids, and I work at a camp. Well, I would be working at a camp if COVID wasn't happening, but sometimes the kids at the camp ask the most brilliant questions. Like, kids are very, very clever, and discussing things like religion and spirituality is actually sometimes a good thing for them because they sometimes challenge you more than you challenge them.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But-
And go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to kind of segue into something that I wanted to ask Jamie about because, you know, when I think about kids, they are imaginative. Their imagination is so great, and oftentimes we start to lose a little bit of that as we enter into adulthood. And I wanted to ask you about a book that I really enjoyed, which was Imagining the Kingdom, liturgies, how worship works. And just a short quote, if I may, for our listeners that might not have read this, and then a question for you. So in that book, you write, both Christian worship and Christian pedagogy have underestimated the importance of this body-story nexus, this inextricable link between imagination, narrative, and embodiment, thereby forgetting the ancient Christian sacramental wisdom carried in the historic practices of Christian worship and the embodied legacies of spiritual and monastic disciplines. Failing to appreciate this, we have neglected formational resources that are indigenous to the Christian tradition, as it were. And as a result, we have too often pursued flawed models of discipleship and Christian formation that have focused on convincing the intellect rather than recruiting the imagination. And moreover, because of this neglect and our stunted anthropology, we have failed to recognize the degree and extent to which secular liturgies do implicitly capitalize on our embodied penchant or storied formation. It's very powerful. Why are story and imagination so critical to our Christian formation in your thought?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for reading Imagining the Kingdom. You are one of 6 people who have done so.
I read it too.
Oh, you're one of 7.
Yeah.
So this is... And by the way, I do think Anglicans kind of have the corner on this market in a sense. Like, I think Anglican spirituality gets this point, which is that God is always at work on us through the whole person, right? And it's not just information upload. It's formational encounter. And my conviction is that we are much more governed by the stories we carry in our bones than the doctrines we carry in our heads. Not that doctrine's unimportant or anything like that. It's just the nature of the human creature as these storied animals, that it's the stories that govern us. And our culture gets that and offers all kinds of rival stories that aren't trying to convince our intellect, but are trying to recruit our imaginations and work and do so. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think this is one of the ways to talk about our assimilation to the defaults of a disordered culture. I mean, I do think this is one of the ways to talk about systemic racism and structural racism. It's if you only think of racism, for example, on this intellectual level as an ideology, right, a set of ideas and beliefs, well, then everybody can kind of, almost everyone can pat themselves on the back and say, I don't believe that, right? I don't affirm that ideology. But that doesn't mean that your imagination hasn't been captured by ritualized stories and narratives that effectively have trained you to imagine that I am the center of the universe, or that they exist to serve me, or whatever it might be. So I think the reason why Christians need to be much more intentional about recruiting the imagination is because if we're not, it's recruited by these other rival stories. And I mean, this is actually one of the reasons why I'm now editor of Image Journal, because I think the arts are at the very heart of this. It's one of the reasons why. Do you know this great line from Benedict XVI? Actually, it's before he was Pope.
Ratzinger.
When Ratzinger said, you know, the church's greatest witness are her saints and her artists. And it's because they both embody stories that are affective and alluring and magnetizing, right, and magnetic. And it's for that reason that I think we need to spend time on the imagination.
Yeah. Well, I was really taken in that book about how you talk about how it grabs at the gut, right? Yeah. Like it's a gut thing. That what if our education, and particularly as it relates to Christian education or formation, is not about filling people up with stuff, right? It's that notion that somehow or another we have to engage all of us. It's like I said earlier, the connection to the racism is brilliant, actually, because you know, when I was that 5-year-old kid, my imagination for what a black person was what I saw on TV. That's all I could know. It didn't matter what was, you know, I mean, nobody, yes, it's in here. And yes, the fear was in here. And yes, so having to come out of that is, you yes,
know. And that tells you, this is why the culture industries, which produce those stories and images and narratives, are forming us. And if they're doing that poorly, or because they are allied with a different story about being human, then we don't realize how much our hearts are sort of being tugged into this rival kingdom.
Yeah. The devils have the best liturgies.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that was part of that paragraph. And you know, Jesus kind of had that figured out, because, you know, he could gather a whole group around and have mesmerized talking about a mustard seed.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's the root of it. Like, who else? This dad's talking about a mustard seed.
Right.
That's right.
Right. So don't you think it has implications for, I mean, I think it has implications for the entirety of worship.
Yeah.
But then if you zoom in, it does transform the way you think about preaching, right? Mm-hmm. So that it's not, and I'm sure you guys get this, but I think there are still way too many, maybe more in my Reformed and Presbyterian traditions, where preaching is kind of the lecture in the middle of the service. And it's of course a sermon can be didactic and instructive, but it has to be, I always say, if you imagine a continuum that goes from a poem on one end to a doctoral dissertation on the other, the sermon should definitely be towards this end of the continuum, right? And that's what the prophets are doing. That's what Jesus is doing. So, yeah.
It's an art. And,
yes.
And you know, I think one of the things you were talking about, how the culture or the devil has the best liturgies, one of the things that we're pushing back on right now, I think, is, you know, along with the rise in populism and right-wing ideology, is this notion that, you know, we have to amplify the tech industry and this, but you know, we're defunding the arts, we're defunding you know, universities that focus on that. All of those things sort of push us away from those things which are so critical to us who are engaged in the work of humanities, in the work of the imagination, you know.
Absolutely.
Anyway,
absolutely.
I have a question from a listener, actually. We just, I think you noticed because I caught up with you on Twitter, but we recently we began on Lenten study as a group.
I was so honored by that.
Yeah, so we had 2 groups. We had a group in the morning and a group at night. We had almost 50 in total, actually. And then we all ended up on Zoom. So, but we did carry on, and it was your book On the Road with St. Augustine, which, let me tell you, is great. It was interesting because it, like, of your books, it's not the most obvious choice to use in a parish study, and
Sure.
But it was interesting to me that it was a challenge for a lot of them, but every one of them came through it with an incredible amount of I would say, formation and change. Like, they really took to it, even though they may have struggled. It was not as accessible as, say, some other work for parish stuff, but it was really well received.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the members of that book club and a faithful watcher or listener of our podcast is a parishioner here by the name of Vicki Anderson. Vicki just chews up whatever book she gets, and she's read a couple of yours now as well.
Mm.
So she wrote me this morning this. She says she wrestled with the chapter from On the Road with St. Augustine about justice. Specifically, you write, I wish there was more lament in Augustine. While in principle Augustine refuses to give evil the comfort of an explanation, he constantly fends off intellectual options that would either make evil an illusion or make God blameworthy. And then she asked, how would more lament help us in understanding evil and understanding Augustine? And then further she asked, she quotes you saying, we explain evil only to explain away love. She would love to hear you speak about that so that she can better imagine, she uses the word, imagine for herself what that might mean. So how would more lament help us in understanding evil and understanding Augustine?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Vicki, and been thinking about it a lot over these last few days. I have to locate this too, the fact that I'm a philosopher, right? So, and evil, interestingly, is a pretty integral problem in the philosophical curriculum. Probably anybody who takes an introductory course in philosophy has some point at which they think about the so-called problem of evil. Mm-hmm. And so what is slightly off-putting about that is it runs the risk of imagining evil as this puzzle to be solved, when in fact evil is an incursion to be railed against. Do you know what I mean? Like the reason why I think lament is different is because it gives vent to both the heartbreak and the anger that we know when we confront evil and we say that ought not to be, right? It's like, right. It's why our language will sometimes get coarse in the face of it. And I think that's entirely fair, because what's happening is we're saying, well, I'm not going to say it, but when you like
everything is welcomed on here, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, when you see that police officer so callously kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, and at that point, there's absolutely no way that the question you should be asking is, why could God allow this to happen? What you should be saying is, why the fuck would you allow this to happen, God? Right. And that is a faithful response. Mm-hmm. That is basically the Psalms.
That's it.
And now I think the trick is that lament is not synonymous with anger, right? It's a particular incorporation of a faithful questioning of God that nonetheless is mysteriously animated by hope. So I think anger that's not lament devolves into despair and pessimism. So I think what's distinctive about lament is it holds together both anger and hope, both protest and labor against evil, right? So I'm not answering the question very well, but the concern is that lament is a much more biblical response than just the cool intellectual solving of the problem. Does that make sense? I also think it has room to what we're doing is, when I lament, it is always in light of the resurrection of the dead, right? It's always in light of the resurrection of Jesus. Anybody who tells you that they have an answer to the problem of evil and never has to mention the resurrection of Jesus is talking about something else. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how you could possibly think about it in that way. So I think there's a temptation for those who are, well, let me put it this way. Lament takes practice, and you have to learn how to lament.
Yes.
And I think if your Christian tradition has squelched any possibility of it for a long time, probably what will happen is the unleashing of it will just be the unleashing of anger. And I'm not going to criticize anybody for that if they're just learning how to lament. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
But that said, what it looks like for us to be schooled by the scriptures is to learn how that anger becomes lament, which is then bound up with our work against evil, our hope that it be otherwise, our ultimate trust in a God who is love, and so on.
If I could we do education for ministry here at the parish. Rob's got a group in his as well. Ron Golka is one of our members. He led worship last night. We had our session, and he decided that we needed to hear Psalm 58, and it's a prayer for vengeance. It's it's a lament. It's and given all what we've witnessed and what we've been subject to, and what he's been going through in his own life. They're grieving the loss of a daughter not so long ago and all that stuff.
Oh gosh.
There's a lot happening, right? And so for him, he's like, you want me to lead worship? Well, here's what you're going to get.
Yeah.
You're going to get lament. And I'm going to do that knowing I'm held in a group here that loves me, that I belong to a community of the resurrection, that I don't believe there's no hope. But right now, what this psalmist says about vengeance, this is what I get right now in this minute.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so critically profound. And I think that's what's profound in what I see in the responses, particularly across America right now, from the church leadership to what's happening in the fallout of George Floyd, is we're hearing our church leaders, thanks be to God, speaking up in ways of lament and saying, we now must call for justice. It's a time for that reckoning in a way. So anyway.
And it's the same in that vein too. I mean, this is what we've talked already today about listening, and it's a moment of listening. And I do wonder, and back to Rob's point about the imagination, we would do well. I would do well to immerse myself and let my imagination be schooled by the blues. The blues is basically the Christian legacy of an oppressed people who knew how to lament.
You sound like a man who's heard Cornell West, man.
Yeah. It's funny. I saw West on TV the other day, and it reminded me of this episode. I was speaking at this big academic conference called the American Academy of Religion. This is years ago. I think I was still a grad student. And I'm giving this talk on Augustine. Academic conferences are the worst. But I sit down at this panel, and I'm nervous as all get out. And all of a sudden, in walks Cornell West, and he sits right in front of me. Wow. And the whole time I'm talking, he's like, "I want to see." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh!" And I was an idiot. I was clueless and naive and things. But he was so gracious afterwards.
Brother Jamie here is bringing it.
Everybody's a brother.
That's great. Jamie, we're coming to the end here. Just a couple other things we wanted to check in with you about. What are you writing now? What are you working on? Anything?
One book that nobody will care. So I'm just finishing up. I've been on sabbatical this past year, and I am an academic, so I still have to sort of dot my I's and cross my T's. So I'm finishing a new collection of essays, studies in philosophy of religion, what we call continental philosophy of religion, which is philosophy that's more shaped by France and Germany than English sources. So that'll come out with Baylor University Press early next summer. But I just was offered a contract for my next book for people who read, normal people. And the book is going to be called When Are We? And I'm trying to articulate the significance of time and history for faithfully living the Christian life. I think too much North American Christianity, perhaps in particular, tends towards a kind of atemporal idealism about a lot of things. And this is going to be a project that tries to lean into what I'm going to call spiritual timekeeping, which isn't just it's not just the liturgical calendar. It's more like, how do you understand the location of being a Jesus follower given the dynamics of history? And if, in fact, one example would be relative to the conversation we've been having today, if somebody says, well, Black Lives Matter, and somebody responds, but wait, we're all made in the image of God, so all lives matter. That is an adventure in historically missing the point, right? Like, that's somebody who's evacuating up to this level of atemporal idealism and doesn't realize that what's true now,
Right. In this moment,
is a different operation, right? It's not that the other thing isn't true, but to say it now is false.
Right.
So it's trying to get at some of those nuances. Don't tell anybody. It's really about Hegel and Kierkegaard and Martin Heidegger. And that's all in the background. But hopefully I'll learn how to bury that so that people don't have to slog through, like the Augustine book. I mean, I just had to do the Heidegger and Camus stuff. I couldn't quite figure out. But for some people, that was like a high hurdle to get over to then get into talking about sex.
Right.
And
it was great to talk. It was great to talk sex with a bunch of seniors in my parish. It was fun.
Hey, that's great. Yeah,
I love it. That's great.
But I got to.
So that's the next project.
I love to hear that you're doing that, and I got to tell you, I've become a big fan. My friend John Marsh put me on to John Caputo, and I've read most of the recent stuff,
Cool.
and so when I picked up your stuff, it was all natural. So I just
Sure.
I thank you for your work.
Sure.
It's great stuff, and thank you for being
Wow.
with us today. Rob's got some fun for you now, I think.
Okay.
Just to wrap up, we do this with all of our guests. Just a quick lightning round, a couple of quick questions so we can learn a little bit more about Jamie. We mentioned
I always feel most nervous about this part, by the way. Go ahead.
This is the fun part. You grew up in Embro, as we mentioned, and we mentioned the Scottish Festival. So question number one, have you ever flung or eaten haggis?
Eaten haggis and love it.
Oh, there we go.
Whoa.
But never flung it.
Never flung it.
Usually one comes after the other.
Yeah.
Highland dancing or break dancing?
Break dancing,
Okay.
which I have literally done in the middle of the roller skating rink in Embro, Ontario.
All right.
That's great. Villanova won the 2018 men's basketball championship, right? A couple years ago.
Yeah.
I'm sure you were at least
I confess I wasn't as attuned as I should have been, but I have one sport that I watch, which is Formula One. But
Formula One. Okay.
Yeah.
We were going to ask you a basketball question too, because Kyle Lowry was a player at Villanova, where you went to school. So I don't know. Maybe I thought maybe you had a Kyle Lowry jersey in your office.
No, yeah, sorry, no, wrong guy.
Okay. And final question: favorite churchy word?
Narthex.
Oh yeah, hey, I love it. Narthex is my favorite too.
That's a
I
good
always say it sounds like something you get removed when you're 8.
Good.
Here's a question: what is on that shirt? Because Rob and we've got a history with Detroit. What does that say?
It's Detroit versus everybody.
Everybody. I like that.
Which is a very Detroit standpoint.
It really is, actually.
Yeah. I grew up in Windsor for the most part, so really.
South Detroit,
That's right.
as they call it.
That's right. And I had 14 years down there before coming here to London.
Yeah,
And
right.
Rob taught me to be a Lions fan, and for that I'll be forever grateful.
Yeah.
The curse.
It continues. Yeah. Well, Jamie, thanks so much for being able to spend some time with us today. We could just go on and on, but I really want to invite folks to look for Jamie's books, of course, under James K.A. Smith. A lot of good reading there, a lot of opportunity for book studies in our parishes and our groups. If you're listening, folks, and you're looking for something to pick up to talk about, certainly want to point you toward that. And we wish you and your family well, and be safe. And thank you so much for being part of our podcast.
Thanks, guys. This has been great fun. Blessings on your ministry.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
too. And come back and see us again when that book is out. I will.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. Shoot me a line. Let's do it. Great.
We'll do it.
Blessings.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Take care. All right, let's wrap it up. Want to say thank you to Jamie for dropping by, and also thank you to our friends at A. Miller George Funeral Home, who have been a great support to our podcast, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Thank you to Ian for all your great work behind the scenes, getting this up for our listeners.
No problem.
Thanks to Kevy for all you do behind the scenes that only I and Ian know.
That's top secret.
Tell everybody, but this guy's really got us rolling along here, and we love you. We appreciate that, and it's good to be together to do this for folks. So that's great. So until we see each other again, We look forward to another podcast when our next guest will be.
We've got Emily Scott coming up next week.
Emily Scott. And more. And you can find out more on our website too, thevicarscrossing.com. So take care, everybody, and have a safe week. And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street.